has already been discussed several times today already. At MRA, science and research really is our crown jewel. And we firmly believe it's the best strategy, in fact, one of the only strategies we have to improve treatments for folks who have melanoma. And as Dr. Hawk mentioned earlier, the progress that's been made in the last 10 years really is staggering, with 12 new FDA therapeutic approaches approved. And the excitement is palpable. Like, there's so many clinical trials happening in melanoma. But for a lot of people, that progress isn't enough yet, and we acknowledge that, and there's still a long way to go. But research is hope for many of us, as we saw again earlier. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about that fine line that once crossed, research and hope can become hype. One of the most poetic ways to describe research is this quote by Isaac Newton that talks about research as standing on the shoulders of giants, so that you can reach higher and higher and get places that you couldn't think of before. And this really is true. Like, this is how research tends to happen. We also want to talk about the idea of iterative growth, or evolving or evolution, versus a revolution where the entire world changes seemingly overnight. So when we were driving a horse and buggy and Henry Ford invented the Model T in 1927, that was a revolutionary change that really transformed our world. From 1927 to the 2015 introduction of the Tesla Model X, not a car person, but it looks beautiful. Even though those are very different beasts, and I would certainly never choose a Model T over a brand new car, those are really examples of evolutionary change over time. The other point I'd like to make here is that both types of change feel awesome. Like, I would never want to trade my new iPhone for one that was 10 years old. So by no means should you think about them differently. It's just important to, as a framework for as we talk later. We also wanted to reintroduce the idea of how science is done. And in elementary school, most of us probably learned about the scientific method, the idea that you hypothesize, test, retest, and then you draw a conclusion. And at any time, you can go back and start that whole process over again because your results aren't being consistent. And this largely is how science happens today. It really happens. Science is a slow, deliberative process, but it really does get us to greater understanding and truth. This process doesn't always feel like a straight line, and I think sometimes that can be very frustrating. Sometimes we're making small steps, sometimes we're making great leaps, and then it also sometimes feels as if we're going backwards, and a truth that we thought was very evident, with the addition of new data, maybe it's not true any longer, and that's also part of the scientific process. We also live in a world where nothing happens in a vacuum. And through technology and the flood of information around us, science is being interpreted in altogether new ways and packaged for new audiences. Where historically, science happened in lecture halls like this with very short presentations on similar topics, and in papers and research articles and a discussion or art. Challenging idea is dissected for years and years. It's now happening in tweets. So it's no wonder why some of the critical context is lost. We also know that the scientific landscape is changing and that there's intense competition for scarce resources. This was a study in 2015 that showed a 15% increase in positive words in academic literature. And when you look specifically at words like robust, novel, innovative, and unprecedented, the increase was 15,000%. So here we are, hope or hype, and the fine line that sits between them. We have a world where there's so many systems of misaligned incentives. There's the fact that we have short attention spans, and we've been trained on the idea that a tweet or a 30-second video is the way that we should consume information. And then there's the fact that the scientific process, while getting us to truth, can sometimes feel a little messy along the way. It's no wonder why it can be difficult for us to think about this and to navigate this as consumers. So with that said, and now I'm going to go sit down, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Liz Labo, who is a senior correspondent at Kaiser Health News. She's won many awards for her series on the hope or hype surrounding cancer care. She also wrote for 13 years on health and medicine for USA Today. And then we also have her joined by Dr. Jason Luke, who is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where he specializes in treating patients with melanoma and early phase drug discovery and development. Dr. Luke is also an MRA-funded investigator, and we're thrilled to have the two of them here for this conversation. I am going to kick it off before I find my seat with the first question. As we talk about the fine line between hope and hype, is this concept something that you think about as you go about your day-to-day work?
For me, it's really forefront in my mind as a journalist. Because as a journalist, I value truth and accuracy, and truth and accuracy are increasingly under assault. So just to be accurate, I feel like it's really important for me to present what a study is and what it isn't, and to put it in context. I also feel a personal connection to not hyping cancer treatment because I've lost dear friends to cancer. My last year or two at USA Today, we lost 4 staff members in one horrible winter. So these are working people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 2 other people from my previous newspaper. So when I would go to ASCO, and I don't know if any of you have ever been there in their exhibit hall where all the pharmaceutical companies advertise their wares. It's like Cancer Palooza. I mean, they must have Hollywood set decorators designing these booths. You step on the carpet and it's 4 inches thick, and there's lights, and it's unbelievable, and it sort of mesmerizes you. And you could come out of there thinking cancer's cured. But of course, cancer isn't cured. If cancer were so easy to cure, then I think what did my 6 friends do wrong? And I see real consequences to hype in giving people false hope and inappropriate expectations, and how inappropriate expectations or uncertainty about their prognosis can really affect their care and their comfort and their decisions about how they want to spend the next few years or months or weeks. So to me, the issue of hope and hype is incredibly serious, and journalists have a huge responsibility to try to get this right. We're the interface, the media between scientists and the public. So since most of you will never get a chance to talk to amazing researchers actually doing the science, more of you will read stories like the ones I write. I feel just a huge responsibility to get this right.
And I guess what I would sort of come at after hearing that is almost like I come at it from exactly the reverse, but meet right back in the middle, which is to say, in clinical medicine, when we see patients in our clinics, the treatment algorithms that we use to which drug we're going to treat a patient with in what setting are generally speaking derived by very large clinical trials that take many years to pursue. And there's a very good reason we use those treatments, as they've been thoroughly studied to be shown that at least on the average or in specific scenarios to be more effective. So in clinic, we're very much grounded in the standard nuts and bolts of what we do. So she was saying she was thinking about it all the time. In clinic, we're also almost never thinking about this because it's totally irrelevant. But that isn't to say it's not important, because in clinic, we have the treatments that we know we have, and we're very much excited about the ones we're going to have. But when we're seeing a patient in front of us, those are not like options we can just grab for. So therefore, they are irrelevant, and we don't really think about them. Now, I'm also a researcher, and I do clinical trials in new drug development, and to me, that's really, that's why I love being an oncologist. I get to interact with people, and we get to think about new approaches to treat cancer. But when we're really treating people, we really try to focus on what can we really do right now. Because I find when I'm trying to develop a plan for treatment with a patient and their family, uncertainty about the idea that there might be some other treatment out there somewhere that is some magical cure, that actually really interrupts the communication about what the right thing to do is right now. So we have drugs that we can give now. In 20 years, might we have different drugs? Yes, but we're not making the decision right now, or we're making the decision now about what to do, not in 20 years. So if that kind of makes sense, she's kind of the police on the front lines. We're kind of the day-to-day doing it. And so it kind of comes back to the middle, which is that we're all excited about new things, and we don't ever want to come off as if we're not. The whole reason you write about these things, I think, is probably because you're excited about the potential. And the whole reason I do clinical trials of new drugs is, again, I'm excited about the potential. And yet the day-to-day is we treat people where they are with the available treatments that we have. And I think that's a really essential thing to think about, because to me, I talk to patients about making a treatment decision is sort of like being in front of a series of bridges. And you can go across the bridge in a different direction. And you need to make sure you feel confident that you choose the one that you think is the right one for you. And you is euphemistically you. I guess we should say we or whatever. I think you have a sense of what I mean. Because you don't know what's going to be on the other side. And so you need to collect the information for what you can reasonably do right now, and then try to go there, and then try to reassess what is the impact of this, and what might be the next step if perhaps the outcome isn't exactly what we wanted. So the hope comes in that it may be the case that if this isn't the right one, that there might be something further, but in the moment, we want to choose the thing that we think has the best upside versus downside. I think this is something we're going to come back to later in terms of thinking about really, truly, what is the right choice for each patient, and how do they think about what is most meaningful to them.
One thing that I discovered in writing this series, Hope versus Hype, some people have said, well, where does hope come from? And really the best answer is, where doesn't it come from? Because it occurred to me that really every person in the cycle, just with the exception of maybe the insurance companies or the employer-funded insurance plans that pay for things, almost everybody, including journalists, have some motivation to hype. If you think about it from the very beginning, a scientist who's just getting started in his or her career gets excited. Maybe they've been working in a basement lab for years. They get no attention. They finally make a tiny advance, and they think it's great. And I interview them, and they tell me, oh, this is world-changing. Well, no. They're not trying to hype. They're not trying to be dishonest. It's a big deal to them because they want to advance their career, maybe a small biotech company. They want their research to be known as a success, and hyping their research can maybe help them get bought out by a big biotech company. The pharma companies, for obvious reasons, want to sell medication. And I think we can't forget about cost, because when your drug costs $250,000, it darn well better work, right? Nobody is going to pay $250,000 for a drug that isn't a miracle, right? So it's in the financial self-interest. I'm not saying people are greedy, or I'm not saying people aren't altruistic. I'm not saying people aren't doing great research. But we have to think about, as a journalist, I always think, what are the motivations when people talk to me? What are these self-interests? And when you're trying to sell a $250,000 drug combination, you need to make it sound really great. So you get these commercials where the drug looks fantastic. Hospitals, are part of this too. Universities are part of this too. Hospitals and universities treat patients. They work with doctors. The marketing departments, they want their university to look good. And the marketing department is what I come into contact with. And the older I get, I feel like an old contrarian. But because I feel like I've been covering cancer now almost 20 years, and I feel like I've had a long enough experience to see these blips come and go, and to see the excitement and the roller coaster. So a lot of my colleagues will get really excited about some new therapy, and I think, well, I remember when people were excited about this drug and it crashed and burned, or this drug and it crashed and burned. So I tend to be a little skeptical. But a lot of journalists really like playing the role of cheerleader, because look, it gets them on A1. To say, well, there's an unknown drug that may offer some promise, a small statistical significance, but more research is necessary. That's not going to get you on the front page, right? That's not going to get you on the 6 o'clock news. So even if a reporter isn't thinking about, I'm going to consciously hype this story to advance my career, no, they're not thinking that. But it's an influence. It's an influence we have to be aware of. So I feel like as a reporter, or when I talk to doctors or nurses or palliative care specialists or ethicists, I feel like it's important to have someone be a brake, not to throw all cold water, not to be nihilistic and say there's been no progress. There's been great progress, but just to have a little bit of a break so that we can be realistic. In one of my stories, I talked to a man named Michael Uvani who lost his older brother to melanoma. And he described the incredible emotional roller coaster that he went through as he took his brother to 6 different hospitals, some of the best hospitals in this country, 6 hospitals all around the country. And his brother lived 3.5 years. And I know if there are oncologists in the room who've treated melanoma, their first reaction is going to be 3.5 years, that's great. Because we know just a few years ago, people used to die in 6 to 9 months. But for this man thinking about his brother, 3.5 years was not enough. And he had really terrible side effects. And so he felt really let down. So I think as a journalist, if I can present the news a little more evenly, so that maybe your hopes are here and not here, your hopes are here and they don't quite make it, maybe it's not as painful for people, and if you exceed the hopes, then that's great. But I just feel like I don't want to be responsible for giving people false hope that will lead them to be more disappointed or to miss the chance to have important conversations about end-of-life decisions.
And I want to make sure that we also offer the opportunity for people to ask questions to make it interactive. I don't want it to feel like we're just up here talking at you. So if you have things you want to talk about, please just raise your hand. There are microphones that are circulating around. I wanted to just give a quick overview while we're doing that. A couple of vignettes that sometimes can sort of frame some of this hype versus hope and just the timelines. So when one is acutely facing illness and you need a treatment now, the idea that there might be something better is really exciting. And yet if you've got to put it in context for a second, you can kind of see the contrast of what we're talking about. So I was a trainee around the time that ipilimumab, which is the CTLA-4 antibody we use in standard practice, as that was coming through clinical trials. And that was about 10 years ago. And that was truly a sea change in cancer. We hadn't treated cancer like that before, and it was really exciting. But the investigators who participated in those clinical trials will tell you it was not like this moment in time where it was this process over years and years and years of these clinical trials. And if you really get them by the bar, they'll tell you that drug almost didn't get approved. There were multiple advisory boards. They were going to get rid of it entirely. And if that had happened, then none of the immunotherapy we talk about today would have ever happened. It was this slug all the way through because you had to interpret the data, and sometimes it looked good and sometimes it looked bad. But now, you fast forward 10 years later, now I'm sort of early mid-career, sadly. I noticed the picture. I have a lot more white hair now. But my trainees now, they just take it for granted, like this always was the case. So they look back and they just were like, yep, that happened. And they think it like, yeah, of course that happened. Like, yeah, they just carte blanche. Yet some of us that participated and others more than me, but it was this process of going through it, right? So there's certainly at the time there were naysayers that said this isn't the right thing. There were patients who wanted to do it, didn't want to do it, and all of that was fine. Another vignette that I'll say is that sometimes we push forward very quickly, but we don't even know whether or not what we're doing and what we're hyping is actually the right thing. And an example here is you're aware of the BRAF and MEK inhibitors from various different companies that are standard treatment, and you know about PD-1 immunotherapies that are standard treatment, and probably most of you have now heard that there's a clinical trial that shows if you give them all together, it works even better. Except that clinical trial doesn't necessarily show that. So there are a whole bunch of issues about how that clinical trial was designed. What was that treatment compared to? So when you see the overlying headline, which is, great advance, added the drugs together, they work great, but then there's kind of more detail down below that. And I get back to the original thing was like, so if I was somebody choosing which treatment to take, you might see that and you might think, oh, well, of course, isn't that the new thing? Well, it's not quite that simple, and these things take many years to kind of come to fruition. And so I think people realizing that the media is not a good avenue, generally speaking, with all due respect, to sort of take on that sort of slow pace of scientific discovery and scientific movement. You know, when you look at clinical algorithms, again, they are the way they are because there's robust evidence that supports them. And generally speaking, if a study is saying, like, you know, we fixed everything in cancer, you can probably think it's probably not quite doing that. Right? You want to go ahead?
Yeah, you mentioned IPI. My wife was in the clinical study in 2007 at Providence. But how do you combat the human tendency to see patterns, even though they aren't there? There's that natural tendency, both probably in researchers and definitely in the general public, to see a pattern, even though none exists.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. So sort of ranging from the lab all the way to the clinic and to patients. In the laboratory, we come at that by reproducibility, right? You have to do the same experiment multiple times. And even in clinic, to some degree, that's also true. So usually one trial isn't enough to say, like, this is the definitive thing. We want to see that this actually worked multiple times. You know, for patients, though, again, going back to what I was saying before, it's a little harder because you're only going to be sick once, presumably, right? And so then you're only going through this process once, and then you're going to want to try to put these things together. And there, I think it's trying to be sort of tethered to the realism of what's real in front of you right now. That's why I said there are the treatments that the doctor says that are available now. And certainly that might include clinical trials of new drugs, but there's a reason it's a clinical trial, because it hasn't been proven to be better than whatever it is you might, you know. And so you might still want to go that route because there's an upside, but you have to realize, and hopefully those discussions are frank, to say, well, there's a reason it's still a research study. We haven't actually proven it's better than something else. So even if in the mice it cured all the mice, even if the first phase 1 clinical trial looked fantastic, the next clinical trial, it might not. And that happens a lot in cancer, unfortunately. So I think that expectation management is a very, very important aspect of this, just to really, again, be tethered to what is practically in front of you or your family members or patients that are going through things.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting to me is even there's even data that you want to get after the phase 3 trial and even after FDA approval.
Right.
I'm looking for where this is in my notes, but there was a really interesting case. There was a really interesting publication where researchers looked at I think it was a liver cancer drug that had a moderate effect. It prolonged survival maybe by 2 months in the clinical trial. But Otis Brawley, who was at the American Cancer Society for a long time, once said, you know, to get into a phase 1 clinical trial, it's like you have to be an Olympic athlete but have cancer. So as many of you have experienced this, the clinical trials deal with people who are much, much healthier than a regular cancer patient. They're being treated at places like Dr. Luke's hospital, the absolute best hospitals in the country. And when you get that same treatment out with people who are older, sicker, you know, they have more diseases, maybe asthma, and maybe they smoke, and they're in a community hospital, some of those benefits can disappear. And there was one study where when we looked at the real world evidence, how the drug was actually used, there was no survival benefit at all. So it was really slim in the FDA trial, and it completely washed out in the real world. And then the other thing we see once a drug is approved too is when a drug is used in a clinical trial, no matter how big the trial is, it's a limited number of people. When it's used broadly, we can see more side effects. And I'm sure some of you have experience with that you can see side effects that weren't really apparent before. So those are things I try to keep in mind as I'm reporting these things too.
Yeah, and I'll make a follow-up comment on that. It's sort of the hype versus hope and how it impacts people's treatment decisions, and a couple of vignettes again. When PD-1 immunotherapy was coming forward and into standard medical practice, almost probably everybody in this room is aware that, you know, former President Jimmy Carter was diagnosed with melanoma, and he was treated with anti-PD-1 immunotherapy. And for all intents and purposes, it seems that he did very well. I'm a medical oncologist that doesn't use the C word, but you know, you might even employ it, right? But that being said, he had a very unique case, and his treatment was much more complicated actually than most people who show up. And for a guy who was like approaching 90, he was very healthy. Mm-hmm. So again, going back to this is not the standard thing. So the reason I raise this is, it was fantastic when this happened. I mean, there's no question, right? As former president, the guy's like, you know, it's great. And it gets the word out, right? But what happened in my clinic was that I saw disproportionately folks coming in assuming that now everybody who got that drug would be do that well, right? But in reality, they do as well, we hope, or maybe not even quite as well, as they did in the clinical trial, which would mean that basically about 1 in 4 would do really well. And again, going back, for us as melanoma docs, that was like unbelievable when we had that happen, 1 in 4, because it used to be like 1 in 100. But so this set the expectations off. So then I would get patients who actually would come back after, say, taking 3 months of immunotherapy, and their tumor looked to be under control. It had shrunk in half. And they were upset because they're like, wait a minute, I thought it was supposed to be gone. And so it's this double-edged sword, right? So the hope is good because it gets people, it gets the word out, everybody gets excited, but then the hype also can be a barrier, actually, to reasonable expectation setting. Because it shouldn't be the case that people who are coming in have that expectation, because it's unreasonable that we would actually put that out there for folks.
Do people have more questions?
Dr. Luke, I have a question for you about when you're in the clinic and you're talking to a patient and their family about the next greatest thing, something that we know that there's some really strong data in support of. How do you talk about that and acknowledge that that exists, but then also bring it to this exact moment in that patient's care?
So I tend to be fairly frank with folks when I talk through things, and so I get into that sort of level of, trying to turn things into percentages or fractions, that 1 in 10, 2 in 5, this kind of thing, to make it more obvious. I also try to make sure it's clear the side effect profile of what we're talking about. So one of the examples that I don't know whether or not, and they've talked about it yet, but it'll be at the meeting, you may be aware that a treatment called tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes or adoptive cellular transfer is approaching FDA approval for melanoma. So in a clinical trial done nationally in patients who had progressed on all treatments, or all approved treatments, got their tumors harvested by surgery, put into the lab and grown in a laboratory dish to get the lymphocytes out. Patients were brought back and given chemotherapy and given back their own cells, and about 40% of them have had their tumors shrink in a really meaningful way. And that's like a really big deal for refractory patients, right? So patients hear about this, they think, well, that's great, right? Well, except take a step back for a second. It means you're gonna have surgery. Because if you have surgery, it means you're out of commission for some number of days, weeks, months. No treatment, right? You have to recover, right? Then the cells are in the dish. They might not grow. It might have been totally pointless to have the surgery because the cells just don't grow. Then you have to come back and you have to get lymphodepleting chemotherapy in the hospital. And going back, not everybody can get lymphodepleting chemotherapy in a hospital. That's basically like having a bone marrow transplant, right? And then you get these cells back, and then it might work. And so my experience, though, despite this being so exciting, is I've referred, we don't do this directly at my cancer center, but I've referred about 15 patients for this therapy, either down to MD Anderson or to the National Cancer Institute. Not a single one ever even got it. Some of them went through the surgery, some of them. So again, the headline number looks fantastic, but then again, what does it really mean? And more than that, then the granular thing is, so say I refer that patient to MD Anderson, and I love MD Anderson, but it's not so close to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Is a patient gonna like move there, right? Are they gonna like be flying back and forth? And certainly I have had patients who could do that, and that's great for them. But for a lot of folks, that's not gonna happen. And so some of these, when I talk about these things, I bring up the practical concerns. I'm a phase 1 clinical trialist predominantly, which means we do very intensive safety-focused clinical trials around new drugs for cancer. And I usually tell the patient, I'm going to start this discussion, I'm going to tell you why this is horrible. If you're still in the room in 20 minutes, we'll come back to why I think this is going to be great, right? Because you're going to have to come here at least once a week, if not multiple times a week. Some of these visits are going to take 8 hours. I can't give you any percentage number on how likely this drug is to be effective. And yet, I'm super stoked about this because in the lab, this looks awesome, right? So who is that the right message for? And what we worry about sometimes is folks that come in saying, do whatever you got to do, I'll take anything. It's like, well, but there's a practical consideration of that. What does that mean? For some families, just the gas money to drive 50 miles just to get to the visits is impractical, right? Depending on what cancer center you go to, I trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is in the Midtown in Manhattan. The parking was like $70, right? Just to be at the visit, right? So this just doesn't work for some people. So I try to present it as it's okay, right? We're going to choose the right thing for the right person at the right time. And we don't know, which treatment is going to be absolutely the best one, which again is why we go back. We do standard treatments first because there's robust evidence for them. And when you proceed to the next line of treatment, it should be sort of like a scientific experiment in that our default position is that it's probably not going to work, right? And that's not easy always for people to hear, but I think it also helps bring in the realism of the moment. And then people can really focus on, well, what would the quality of life mean for me to be in the car all the time to come to get this treatment that I don't know whether or not it's going to work. And for some people, they're going to drive from, not a joke, I worked in Chicago previously. We'd have people come from New York State every week, all the way, both ways, to get on a phase 1 trial, right? Because they thought that was the right thing for them, generally speaking, younger people, right? And I got other people who live like 3 blocks from the cancer center, and they're like completely out of your mind. Like, I'm not coming here again. You don't even know the treatment works. And that's okay, right? But those are the considerations when we start unpacking this, that we want to make sure people are choosing treatments based on the reality and what they think is right for them in that moment. And that's not necessarily to slug them with every drug that we can possibly get off the shelf, right?
And one thing I think about is palliative care, and there's so much misunderstanding about what palliative care is. A lot of people assume it's hospice, and I'm seeing a lot of you nodding your head, and actually hospice is a type of palliative care. But palliative care has been shown, and this was one of the stories that I feel like it really was a landmark story, and I wrote it for USA Today by Jennifer Tummel in the New England Journal of Medicine, finding that people with stage 4 lung cancer who got palliative care lived months longer than those who didn't. And that's been replicated over and over and over again. And ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, now recommends anyone with advanced cancer get a palliative care consult within 8 weeks of diagnosis. And what I think would be great about this, it sounds great, unfortunately, there aren't enough palliative care doctors to go around. I found this with geriatricians. I desperately wanted to find geriatricians to treat my aging parents. I couldn't, there weren't any in their small town. But one thing that palliative care doctors do is they don't just give you pain relievers or make you comfortable, but they talk about setting expectations, and they talk about what are your values and what's important to you. And I think if people had this kind of conversation early on, that it might help them to decide their approach to treatment. Because this family I talked about who went to 6 cancer centers around the country, that was exhausting. And you might think, yeah, you know, if I have X amount of time left, maybe I want to travel, but I don't know if I want to travel to the hospital. Maybe I want to go and see that mountain I've always wanted to see. Maybe I want to make up with my brother who hates me. So there's sort of a lot of decisions people can have, and some doctors have told me that when patients are sort of holding out hope, you know, that they're going to be in the 50% of patients with melanoma for whom the immunotherapy really works, that sometimes they can delay thinking about these important conversations. And so that's something I worried about. And I try really hard to write all of my stories so everyone can understand them. And I think that's really important because studies show that even when doctors or other people talk, sometimes patients don't quite understand what it means. A woman who is a doctor told me her mother was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer, and the doctor told her there was a 25% chance her tumor would respond to chemotherapy. So her mother thought, oh, respond means cure. I have a 25% chance of cure. And a lot of you probably know, no, respond just means that your tumor shrinks.
30%.
Yeah, it doesn't mean you're going to be cured. She actually had incurable cancer. And I've written a lot about communication because it's so important. You know, even when people really try to get this communication issue right, there was a small study in 2011 where they looked at people with advanced cancer, and they gave them educational material saying, in this setting, there is no chance of cure. And when they talked to the patients afterward about what they took away from that, 1/3 of them thought their disease was curable. So even if our conversation and our communication is perfect, which it never is, sometimes the patients themselves, when we talk about who has an incentive or motivation to hype, it can be patients themselves and their family members. I'm sure some of you have met family members who sort of push people to get treatments. In this case, with the guy who went around to 6 hospitals, his family did not want to take no for an answer when they talked to a doctor, and the doctor said, well, you're not responding to this therapy. And then he sort of paused, and the doctor wanted them to say something. And I think he maybe paused to let it sink in, and the brother of this patient said, what, so you're just going to send us home to die? And so then the doctor said, well, there's someone else down the street, you know. So then the doctor felt, okay, so I'll refer you and sort of kick this patient down the road to another hospital where there was something they could try. So the patient and the family themselves were sort of hyping, and they had these expectations. They didn't want reality. They really wanted the dream. So there's just pressure from all over. And I guess I wouldn't be so passionate about it if I didn't think about a good friend of mine who died in the ICU with metastatic breast cancer. And she was a very clear-eyed journalist herself. But when faced with this disease, she wanted to believe that she wasn't going to die. She didn't want to accept that. And her doctors kind of gave her mixed messages about it. So when I talked to her boyfriend later, he said, look, one doctor said you're doing great. The next doctor says you might want to take a break and think about palliative care. When given a choice, we picked the answer we liked. So, you know, I called her up, hoping to see her. It would have been my last chance to see her when she was conscious before she died. Her boyfriend picked up and said, no, Marie's in the toilet. She's throwing up from the treatment. And then 2 weeks later, he texted me that she was in the ICU and they were going to take her off the ventilator. And I just thought, you know, if someone had been more honest with her, you know, maybe she would have had a better Christmas. You know, that's not a great place to spend. You know, no one likes being in the ICU. So I'm kind of passionate about this idea that we need to improve communication about cancer so that people really understand. And I hold myself to that standard as a journalist. I don't want to crush anyone's hopes or say immunotherapy is terrible. Immunotherapy is great. I have a friend with bladder cancer who's doing great after immunotherapy. I have another friend with metastatic colorectal cancer. He's got something called Lynch syndrome, where he got metastatic disease in his 40s. He's really young. And he and his wife have been through a roller coaster. So it's not easy, but you know, he's still with us. So anyway, I just think there are real downsides to hype, and that's something.
Can I make a comment? In melanoma, obviously we're here to talk about melanoma. It's even like slightly more complicated, where these issues of communication become even more pressing, because we do know that some patients will go into long-term response. And we don't necessarily know what those mean. You know, you're probably all aware now of the 5-year data for our treatments showing fairly substantial numbers of patients that are doing very well at that point. So it's a hard thing. And I think this is where it's become complex. It used to be that when you're trained as an oncologist, it was actually, first visit, you got to say it, patient has to hear it, and you got to push them to that place. Now it's harder. But it doesn't mean that the communication's not important, because I think sometimes we lose sight of how people are doing over time. As an odd twist, we've learned with immunotherapy that the best biomarker that we have is actually what the immune system looks like after we give the treatment for a little while, not actually before we started. And to some degree in the clinic, it's actually the same thing, which is to say we don't necessarily need to dwell on this good or bad, but you can start to get a sense of where this is going fairly quickly. And I think that's really the key, is to stay close and to stay in communication and to continue that conversation, because what you don't want to do is never have the conversation and get farther out where people perhaps wouldn't make the decisions they would have, because you sometimes can't go back if you end up in the ICU.
I have one more question, and then I'd really like to open it up to the floor. But we've talked a lot about setting appropriate expectations and the importance of good communication. But I'm curious if you have tips or strategies or other ideas about how patients and family members in this room, advocates, can help other people as they're navigating this. And then I'm also curious, like similar to that, if there are tips for things you should look for as you're consuming information or media or Dr. Google, so that you can kind of check yourself and be your own brakes.
Well, I would, because I've been thinking about this one, so I've been sitting up here about, look, what if you're a patient, you don't know anything about science, you don't know anything about medicine, or a patient's family, and you see an article, how do you know whether or not you should really believe it? You should just read it and see if you understand it. If you don't, it's not real. That sounds really simple, but it's totally true. So if you read it and it says that, some fish were cured of melanoma, right, or mice or something, then it's not people, right? If the thing says, we put 200 people over here and 200 people over here, and this number got better, then that might be true. And so the hard part is that science builds from a place, right? It's not to say that the science is wrong, it's that is it relevant to where the person is at now? And so I think it's really honestly almost that simple. It's like if you can't figure out how this would tangibly change what you would be doing right now, then it probably doesn't really matter. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean you can't be excited about the process of where it's all going, but that is just a pretty simple way to be able to do it.
And I mean, an easy rule is if it seems too good to be true, it is, right?
Yeah.
There's so much, there's active propaganda coming at us from hostile foreign countries all the time. But, and some of it surrounds things like coronavirus. If it sounds like it's something from a movie, those are the really obvious things. But one thing that bothers me a little bit when people do write about cancer is often they'll have one person in the article who's done amazing. And I know how they got that one person, and it's because the drug company has selected them and has carefully shepherded that person everywhere they need to go and has hooked them up with all the media. And you'll often see the same person in every single article. And I know this because, I would try to write a story about a drug, and people would say, well, is there a patient I can talk to? And the patient is always referred to by the drug company. And it's always the patient who did the very best. And what you want to know is, great, I'm so glad this person is cured. But what's the denominator? If you go back to like the fractions you did as a kid, is this 1 out of 2 people? And so, okay, so half the people did great, okay. But what if there were 100 people in the study? What if there were 1,000 people in the study? And that one person looks great, and you could have 999 who are doing terribly. So it's really important when you see a story, try not to get too seduced by that one patient who's doing amazingly well. And if a reporter is at all responsible, they will at some point in that article tell you what that denominator is, tell you how many other patients didn't do well. But what I really found is we cling to the hopes that we want to hear, and we generalize. That's how our brains work. So I even think that if we have one patient who's done amazingly well, and I tell you in a little aside, oh, by the way, everyone else in the study died a horrible death, you're not going to remember that one line. You'll skip right over that, and you focus on this one person. So I really try when I write a story to make sure that the person I interview, if I interview someone, is representative of all of the data. I'd rather to talk to someone who does middle well. So again, it's the Jimmy Carter example. Jimmy Carter did great. Not everyone does as well as he does. So journalists, when we have journalism conventions, we actually talk about this a lot and how to use an anecdote like that responsibly. So that's one of the things that I just really think about, and try if possible to. I always tell journalists when I'm teaching or when I'm talking in lectures, to try to get the C word, the cure word, out of their vocabulary, to ban words like miracle or landmark or breakthrough. I can't write today about a landmark study because a landmark means it changed something. I won't know if something is a landmark until maybe 10 years from now, right? It's very hard to know what's going to absolutely change practice. So when you see those words, the journalist should have crossed them out, just mentally cross them out, or mentally highlight them, that you should just always be a little more skeptical. And sometimes you can get good patient material. Sometimes a few medical journals and some good patient-oriented websites will try to help you translate the information. And you can ask your doctor to explain it to you as well, of course.
Yeah, I think that would be the other thing is when you should always feel comfortable to take anything you're interested in to your treatment team to get their take on it. But I would caution that sometimes I've run into patients or families that are frustrated by the fact that a physician or a practicing person didn't know about the thing that they took them. But instead of realizing that probably means the thing they took them doesn't have that much impact, but that's again a way you can sort of self-regulate, right? So science and drug discovery and clinical trials is a dispassionate phenomenon, right? We all of course hope it's going to go great, but you want as much as you can evaluate it in a way that isn't infused with attention that you want it to be the case that it's better or worse than it is. It just is what it is. And so you need to use that information in a way that can help to make a decision in the context of somebody who's having to make such decisions. Right. One of the things I wanted to highlight here again about we have in melanoma, despite the tremendous progress, right? We're not done. There are a whole bunch of phase 3 clinical trials that could change practice again that are going to read out over the next couple of years. And I don't know if people have heard of them, but the oncolytic virus, there are different immune molecules, there are cytokines, you combine all the treatments together. So this is all fantastic, except it's exactly what I said before, which is to say, even if these trials are positive, we won't know how to use them. They're not randomized against all each other, right? So it's maybe that all of a sudden, instead of having 4 options, we're going to have 8. Well, then what are we going to do? So we have to, again, sort of be dispassionate about it and realize that we have a long ways to go. So even though it sounds like we're on the cusp of having all these more treatments, we won't necessarily know which one is the best for which person. So then it's going to come down to that discussion about how do people process things, what is most meaningful to them, how often they want to come to the doctor, what side effects are they worried about, and these kinds of things. So you have to just kind of take it in that this is a very slow process, and that work with the information that is immediately in front of you in terms of trying to make a treatment decision.
We have a question right here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth from Washington, D.C., and I wanted to circle back to the communication part, and specifically with the doctor. I've had some oncologists who are wonderful communicators. I ask a lot of questions. I've had some ones that are terrible. I wonder what kind of training you got with communicating on that front, if any, and when you are in what you're doing now with having a practice, do you get together and talk about how do we communicate with these people who keep coming in here, or is every oncologist on his or her own? I really am curious about this.
It's pretty simple, no training. So the USMLE will be really mad. There's actually an exam that training residents have to take that's supposed to demonstrate that they have empathy and they know how to wash their hands and they know how to talk to somebody. But you know this just from your regular life. There are people you talk to, they're gregarious, they're outgoing, they communicate with other people that are less that way. So this is a huge area of medical education and medical research, how to improve this in a meaningful way. But I would say that over the near term, this is probably not something that's going to change dramatically. Just like you just said, there's some people that communicate well, some people that communicate in certain ways, other people that don't. And so it's very much the case that you should find a provider group you feel comfortable with. And I can say, obviously, I get pretty excited about stuff, and I want to talk, and this is me talking slow, right? So some people love that, and they're really into it. But I fully recognize some people don't. But I also try to tell them, I will not be offended if this is too much for you, right? And you shouldn't worry about it either. And some patients do worry about this, that, the doctor won't like me or this or that. It shouldn't matter whether or not the doctor likes you. I mean, I guess if you live in a place where there's only one doctor, then, I don't know, you maybe got to be careful a little bit. But it should be the case that people take multiple opinions, right? You should go out and hear, because hopefully you hear the same thing multiple times, and then you can go with the person who says it to you in the way that you think it comes in the best. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Well, I'm not real surprised at that answer that you gave about no training. And, maybe it's because, math and science are hard. And my sister's a doctor, and I remember everything she had to go through and memorize. And those things are really, really hard. And I'm sure there's, maybe there's a bias to thinking, talking. That's just talking. Anyone can talk. Anyone can talk. There's no science to that. But, I think that the research, unfortunately, on communication is pretty damning. And when you think this incredible science that I could never do, because I couldn't take the math and the physics and the organic chemistry, all kinds of stuff I could never do. But as great as that is, it can be kind of useless or not used at all if it's not communicated effectively to the patient, because the communication is how it gets from a brilliant doctor's mind into someone's body. There was a study in the Journal of Clinical Oncology when they looked at cancer patients who had less than 6 months to live. Only 5% had an accurate understanding of their illness and their prognosis. 38% couldn't remember ever talking to their doctor about their life expectancy. And in this story, I profiled a man with metastatic lung cancer whose doctor had also never told him, in spite of multiple surgeries and chemo and radiation, how long his life might last. And then another classic study in the New England Journal from 2012, when they looked at people with metastatic lung cancer and people with advanced colorectal cancer, 69% of the people with incurable lung cancer thought they could be cured. And all of these people were getting chemo, and the doctor was giving them chemo as palliative chemo, meaning it might shrink your tumor a little bit so you can breathe more easily. We're going to try to make it less terrible, but the intent of the chemo, which is horrible, as you all know, can be horrible, is not to cure them. And yet 69% of these people with lung cancer thought they were going to be cured, and with the people with the colon cancer, 81% of them thought this awful chemo they were going through was going to cure them. So I think I'm sorry to say that's kind of damning, and I have more studies. I won't read them to you. There's just a lot of studies that show that people often don't understand, and it's not all the doctor's fault, because as you saw, I read you that little line from the pamphlet. Patients, often want to hear. Patients will say, I want to be told the truth, but they also want to be told they're going to live and that everything's going to be great. So communication is really, really hard. But I hope future medical students will study some of these things and learn more about it.
Yeah, and going back to in the melanoma space, it is pretty complicated. So as opposed to kind of some of those stories, we often have a different sort of pace of the cancer, which is to say that we're often in a place where we're up front trying something, and if it starts to go wrong, it's pretty obvious pretty quickly that things are going the wrong way. And so hopefully, that allows an opportunity space for people to have those conversations. But again, helping, if it's family members, if it's people that you know, to ask the right questions about what is meaningful to them, I think is a missed opportunity a lot of the time. One of the things that, again, many of my patients are on clinical trials, and I take it kind of as carte blanche, despite the fact I talked to them an hour before, and then they signed up, that once they leave, they're only going to remember like 5% of it. So I tell them, you take this form with you, and then you're going to go home and get a pen and just read it again, start circling everything that you don't understand. And when you come back the next time, bring your family member who isn't here, who isn't going to know any of it, and then we're going to go over it again. And that's a clinical trial, but it's just as relevant in clinical practice as well, right? So these are very intense decisions to make, and then you're caught up in it. When you leave, you're going to forget a lot. So multiple communication, multiple attempts to talk it through, so that you don't go down the route of doing things that otherwise might not.
Are there any other questions?
I did want to add one more thing very quickly about translating hope. Like between hype. So one of the things that, and again, I know this is like chatting to the choir about this, but in the United States, the clinical trial participation rates are very, very low. And when we think about, how many people read newspaper articles and they're so excited about whatever it is they read because, of course, this is going to cure cancer or whatever. So communicating to people, though, to at least consider participating in trials or talking to physicians about participating in clinical trials. That's really where this could meet. This is where it should meet. For the people who are going to be excited enough to go out and search for things, the thing that practically could impact on the outcomes of someone they know or them themselves is participating in a clinical trial, all right? So doing things off-label, just doing, because supposedly there was a study, there's no way you're ever going to know whether or not that helped. And sometimes I tell patients this, you'll only know if it didn't help, because if it doesn't go well, you'll know it didn't work. But if it does go well, you don't know if you ever needed it in the first place. So I can't emphasize that enough, that communication around discussing clinical trials and not letting the idea of participating in a trial seem really foreign is really important. People read about, just for example, like I just saw it, vitamin C. Vitamin C cures everything, right? So why not give vitamin C with immunotherapy? And actually there's some evidence that might be a good idea. But if you just do it, you'll never know. But if we do it together and everybody does it, so it's one of these things where the patient might seek it out because they think it sounds great, and then if you presented a clinical trial to them of doing the same thing, they would say no, because they don't want to do a clinical trial. And that's not wrong, it's to their decision, but as long as they've thought it through a little bit, right? So we need to study these things. There's a reason that we have the questions that we have, and it's important that people really consider participating, because that's really the only way we really know whether or not we have the opportunity of a new treatment.
Cody had asked before what's a red flag or some guides to reading some of this literature. A red flag to me that always signifies this must be snake oil or at least misguided is if someone tells you about a treatment that works for everything. This will cure your cancer, it'll cure your arthritis, it'll cure your Alzheimer's, it'll cure your asthma. That's never true. That's never true. And even with something like vitamin D a few years ago, there's research on that making it look like that was good for everything. Well, it turns out maybe people who take vitamin D, it was just a marker for healthy people. And when they did really rigorous clinical trials, it fell apart everywhere. I stopped taking my vitamin D. So the reason vitamin D seemed to be so good for you is that only healthy people took it. And when you really randomize people to take it, the results disappeared. So I'm suspicious of anything that seems to work for everyone.
I'm sorry to belabor that, but that's actually really relevant in cancer setting as well. Many people in here are probably aware of some of the clinical trial setbacks that we've had over the last couple of years. For 10 years, everything we were doing in melanoma was working, and then actually the last two big randomized phase 3 trials didn't meet their primary endpoint. But those are really important trials because they really confirmed what she just said, which is it turns out PD-1 immunotherapy works really well, and that if you give it to healthy people and you give something with it, it still works really well. And that was important, though, because that was a good grounding that the field needed to better understand that our experiments need to be better. They need to be designed better than they are. So those people that participated, it was really, really important they did because they helped us learn that. And that's been really essential to the field to actually be more skeptical about some of the other treatments that supposedly were the greatest next thing, to evaluate them more rigorously before we push them out and let everybody decide that even though we don't have the data yet, it's going to be the greatest thing.
And there's a real publication bias in academic literature, of course, that people talk about that, again, a drug company making a drug maybe doesn't want to publicize that it was a colossal failure and caused heinous side effects. So they just sort of put that away and they don't submit that and shelve that drug. So it can. And then what do I as a reporter report on? Well, we tend to report on things that appear in journals. So that publication bias and that positivity bias gets amplified. So it can seem like everything works. If I only write about successful trials, people will start to think all drugs work. People have, inflated ideas of what the FDA does. People tend to think the FDA only approves things that are incredibly successful, and that's not true. So we always have to remember that when we're reading about things and it seems like we're making this inevitable progress, for every one successful drug, there might be 1,000 drugs that failed. So it's, just because there's a new drug doesn't mean it's going to be better. And the one last caveat I'd give about looking for information is maybe I have an establishment bias, but I like to read establishment official sources. I go to the National Cancer Institute, I go to the American Cancer Society, the Melanoma Research Alliance. I go to places like the CDC and the FDA. Obviously, everybody in this room is educated because you wouldn't be here otherwise. So we're talking to the cream of the crop here, and maybe you guys all know this, but I really direct people to official, recognized authorities. Joe's cancer blog is not where I'd go, and certainly on social media. I've seen it most recently with the coronavirus. The misinformation spreads faster than the virus. So always look at what the source is.
Right, so I want to thank you both for this fascinating conversation. I know I found it really interesting, and I'm sure the audience did too. I think you'll both be hanging around for at least a little bit if people have